So here we are, continuing Unit 3, which is human population and its effects. So last chapter was the human population, and the next 3 chapters are going to be the effects of the human population. The first of which is urbanization, the urban environment, and creating sustainable cities. So this is what we're going to talk about. The scale of urbanization. We're going to define urban sprawl, which is a big idea. We're going to talk about planning and land use strategies, and talk about ways to make cities sustainable. And we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of urban centers. So the west coast of the United States has been pretty progressive for a really long time. Portland, Oregon saw an issue with how growth was happening and the idea of sprawl. So they set something called an urban growth boundary, which is a law that required, it was like a line, a boundary, that's why it's called an urban growth boundary, on a map that separated urban areas from rural areas. So if you were within that urban growth boundary, you could develop and encourage and do commercial and residential things. You could build, you could improve. If you were outside the urban growth boundary, you had to have a really good reason to develop outside that urban growth boundary. It did a really good job making downtown Portland a lot more revitalized, okay? But they thought it was really oppressive. It really restricted the growth that people wanted outside of the urban growth boundary. So they took urban reserves, so you could develop small areas outside of that urban growth boundary. But then they had rural reserves where you had to leave it the way that it was. This is a common thing, and we're going to talk about a couple examples of it as we look at habitat loss, urban sprawl, and what to do with this growing population. So here's our Captain Obvious statement. As of 2007, most of the world's population lives in an urban area, and that movement from rural or small town life into cities is called urbanization. And it really started when we started with the idea of increased agricultural production. It wasn't just subsistence farming anymore. We had methods that allowed for people to not do subsistence farming, which is just enough when you farm just enough to feed your family. And it got even faster when the Industrial Revolution hit in the 1800s. And there were jobs in the cities that were more lucrative than the jobs, out in the rural areas. So that's where you see a lot of big cities starting to grow and build up, and populations in those cities starting to increase. We talked about that. It varies from country to country how fast urbanization takes place. In the developed countries like the United States, we wind up having urbanization slowed down quite a bit as the result of people wanting to live in suburbs. So, the suburbs of New York City, like Long Island, the suburbs of Philadelphia, the suburbs of Camden, etc. Okay, so people want to live there rather than in the urban areas or in the rural areas. And that's part of what contributes to urban sprawl, which we're going to talk about. Even out here, it's spread out into exurbs, okay, which is even a little further out, which we'll talk about. Urbanization is happening faster in developing countries because people are trying to get away from war and ecological degradation. In the cities, it just tends to be safer. All right. So where do cities exist? Most of the cities exist where you can have transportation. They're by a river, by the coast, right? So most of the colonial cities, that the oldest cities in the U.S. that exist because they're near the ocean, or on a river. As train lines have developed or highways have developed, we've been able to move further inland. So a lot of our cities are further inland. Dallas-Fort Worth popped up where it is. It's what they call the Metroplex, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Because if you look at a map of Dallas and Fort Worth, it's just all connected by big highways like this. It was fueled by the oil industry. I've been to the Dallas-Fort Worth area and like in a shuttle from the airport, and I don't know how people learn to drive out here. I mean, it was hard when I was growing up getting on 78 to drive. I can't imagine. You've got the service roads and the ramps and all of these crazy highways coming together. I couldn't imagine. Urban areas like this and areas in Florida and southern areas, as the baby boomers get older and start to retire, these places tend to grow faster because people don't want to live where it's snowy. In the 19th and 20th centuries, at the beginning of the 20th century, cities weren't really good places to live. In terms of economics, it was the hub, right? That's where the jobs were, but it was crowded. People were poor a lot of the time. Disease was running rampant, and the crime rates were really high. So post-World War II, the veterans came home from World War II, and they pretty much decided, you know what? I served my country. I, lost the limb. I took bullets. I put my life on the line for my country. I deserve better than these city conditions. So that's when the suburbs started to happen. People wanted to move out of the cities and have better schools, more space, and basically a safer place to live. So when that happened, that spread to the suburbs. Populations decreased in urban areas, and so did the economies of those urban areas. So I talked about the exurbs before. Here we are considered the exurbs, okay? You guys know that it takes us a while to get anywhere, but it's like 15 minutes from my house to a grocery store. So it's really not suburban, it's more exurban. But it doesn't take us we have pretty good access to major highways to get us into those urban areas, okay? So suburbs and exurbs, as opposed to urban areas, provide more space per person, right? Minimum zoning in Delaware Township, where I live, is 6 acres, okay? So if you have 3 people or 4 people in a house on 6 acres, it's 2 acres or so, maybe a little less per person. So compared to an urban area, compared to a city, there's a lot more space per person. That has created something called sprawl. So we're going to talk about sprawl. Sprawl is what it sounds like. It's the spread of low density urban or suburban or exurban development out from an urban center, okay? So here's an example of Las Vegas. That was Las Vegas in 1972. The green shows development, okay? Las Vegas in 1997, Las Vegas in 2018. Okay, Las Vegas is in the desert, right? So you've got all of this development as of 2018 in an area that doesn't have a whole lot of water. So there's a big problem. But that's the idea of sprawl, the spread of development out from an urban center. So what you wind up getting is stuff that looks like this. You put homes on bigger lots than what you would see, in an apartment in the city, that are spread out pretty far away from urban centers. So they have to take highways to get there, and that's what you see, all of these highways. So 2 things that cause sprawl, okay? is the human population growth. We know that the population is growing. It's still growing exponentially to the point where we're over 8 billion people. Okay. So human population growth is part of that reason why sprawl is happening. But it's not so much that. Okay. If we stayed in urban centers and really looked at developing urban areas appropriately, we could handle human population growth. The big thing is per capita land consumption per person. That has gone up tremendously. Okay. Economists originally thought that growth was a good thing. So it's sprawl. It's good. How can it be bad? And there are definitely some downsides of sprawl. So you don't have a whole lot of transportation options when you have urban sprawl. Okay. So you don't really have rail lines and bus lines too much. So if you live in the suburbs or the exurbs, and you guys know this, you have to drive everywhere. Okay. So I have friends, when my husband was working before my daughter was born, he was driving to Newark, Delaware from Delaware Township. That's 90 miles one way. Okay. And he was doing that 4 days a week because they didn't have offices located locally, right? That's changed a little bit. They've made some changes, but you have to drive everywhere. So you're spending more time in your car. What's the downside of spending time in your car? You are burning more fossil fuels, right? Because you are driving. So you're releasing carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and sulfur-containing pollutants into the atmosphere, increasing atmospheric pollution. We're going to talk more about that later. The other thing that happens when you pave areas, right? Blacktop, concrete, even some of the stone driveways that we have out here, that water can't percolate down into the ground. It can't get back down in to recharge aquifers, okay? So that water runs off. We've definitely talked about runoff. As it runs off, it takes whatever it's carrying with it, whatever's on that surface. So salt, which can then cause plants to die because they shrink from salt poisoning essentially, or it contains motor oil or any of those pollutants. That water that runs off is going to make its way eventually into the creeks and streams and cause water pollution. Okay, so this sprawl and the increase in impervious areas causes this to happen. Okay, it also promotes physical inactivity. Right? So instead of walking to the store or walking to the post office, you have to get in the car and drive. That also increases the risk of the diseases of inactivity, okay, like diabetes and obesity and heart issues. As more land is developed, there's less that's left open, whether it's farmland, ranch land, or forests and fields. So what you're doing is creating habitat fragmentation, which is a problem, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. And any of the funds that we would use to maintain those urban downtown centers, those Main Street USA kind of places, instead of spending it there and revitalizing the downtown urban center, we are using that money to extend sewer and water, municipal sewer and roads for those outlying areas from the suburbs in particular, not so much the exurbs, but definitely the suburbs. So we're losing money as well. It's possible to create a livable city through this idea of city planning or urban planning. And it's a really conscientious, informed, deliberate way of putting a city together to make it the place that people want to be. So Washington, D.C. was one of the first cities that was intentionally planned, right? Out here, we wind up with regional planning. So you have the county planning office or the township planning office that works in conjunction with the county planning office to kind of use that vision across the board. The original plan for Washington, D.C. is actually still honored today. in terms of the system of grids and streets that allow space for monuments and that kind of thing. So they've stayed pretty true to that original plan, which is kind of cool. Zoning is one way that we can allow planning to take place. We can restrict the kinds of development that happen in certain areas, okay? So if you walk down Main Street in Flemington, or Main Street in Lambertville, or Main Street in New Hope, okay? This is what you wind up seeing, okay? This dark blue cross plus here, okay? That's called town center mixed use, right? So town center mixed use has like shops and stuff on the bottom, on the ground floors of the buildings that are on that Main Street, the downtown area, but above it's apartments, okay? And as you get outside of that, you wind up with downtown center residential. So some of like the back streets of Flemington or the back streets of Lambertville that are off that main drag. Okay. You go out a little further, you have your high density residential. So these are your bigger developments. Here's your high density residential. Your medium density residential versus your low density residential. That's kind of like where we live. Commercial is business. Highway commercial is business on a main highway. So there's a main highway somewhere in here. All right. Industrial is the red. So you have a good solid mix of land use in here, which then promotes a good use of the land and like a smart use of the land. That urban growth boundary we kind of talked about, it's a line to separate the developed areas from the undeveloped areas. And there's some examples. So inside the urban growth boundary, it looks like a city. Outside, it's farms and agricultural space. And there's a picture of the urban growth boundary. Inside is the lighter color, and outside of it is the darker color. And it's expanded over the course of time. Something that happened as a result of the development of the urban growth boundary is that real estate inside the urban growth boundary has become a premium, okay? So if you're going to live in this city, if you're going to live within that urban growth boundary, it's going to be expensive because there isn't a whole lot of space inside that urban growth boundary. So what's wound up happening is that people who have been living within that urban growth boundary for a generation or two, with that middle income, they can't afford to stay there anymore because the land is at such a premium. So that's the idea of gentrification. And we're going to talk a little bit about that with some specific examples when we get to the key points for this, because it's something that's really concerning to urban planners and to those in government. So this idea, it's called smart growth and new urbanism. How do we do these cities in a way that's sustainable? So there are the 10 principles. I would suggest that you make note of those 10 principles of smart growth. So mixed land use, make it walkable, be aware of open space, give people options for transportation rather than just having to drive, and really get everybody on board, get the stakeholders, the people who have a say, who would have, see the impacts of these decisions, have them involved in the conversation, which really kind of makes a lot of sense. The idea of new urbanism is basically to create walkable, smaller cities and neighborhoods with everything that you need without having to walk. In a lot of cases, they are centered around rail lines. And Washington, D.C., the area around Washington, D.C., there are metro stops where you can literally walk to the train station, get on the train, and be in Washington, D.C. in 15 minutes. It's actually pretty cool. So that's the idea of new urbanism, being more intentional about how you design your cities to make them walkable and reduce that idea of sprawl. transit options. You need options for people to get around. So bicycling. Out here, you can't bicycle. Like, it doesn't make any sense for you to get on a bike because there's no safe path. And it's going to take you way too long to bike anywhere. So making that kind of thing an option, bike racks, bike lanes, paths, specific places for you to be able to ride your bike. Mass transit. The link is our mass transit out here, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because, the routes are not convenient. So buses, trains, subways, light rail. It reduces a lot of energy consumption. Okay, you can see the off-peak and regular passenger vehicles, how much energy it consumes versus those. And it's the same thing for how much it costs. Okay, so it costs a lot more to operate a vehicle in any size city, roadway costs and parking costs. So it's actually, the idea of public transit or mass transit is a really smart idea, but it doesn't happen out here. We in the United States tend to lag behind in terms of mass transit, and it makes sense. We're going to talk about Eisenhower. So Dwight Eisenhower, the interstate highway system in the United States is called the Dwight Eisenhower Interstate Highway System because in the 1950s, he was presented with a choice. And cars in the 1950s were inexpensive. Gas was inexpensive, and the population of the United States was not that big, and cars were slow in the 1950s. So he had a choice to invest in a highway system or to invest in mass transit, like railways and that kind of thing. So based on all the information he had, he decided to build the interstate highway system. 80 years later, 70 years later, it didn't work out the way he thought. Okay, so he made the best decision with the information that he had, but it wasn't the right decision in a historical sense. But he did the best that he could. So that's one of the reasons why we don't have a whole lot of mass transit, because of a decision made in the 1950s. But we do lag behind most nations in terms of access to mass transit. So there you go. Why? Low population densities, inexpensive fuel. It would be really expensive to retrofit and go in and do that and really change the infrastructure in the United States. But we're not there yet. We're not ready to make that kind of commitment. If you are a city dweller, you need green space. Okay, so they have parklands like Central Park in this picture. It gives you contact with the green space. It's that idea of biophilia that we talked about earlier. So there are parks and gardens. The idea of a smaller green space, like a community garden or a playground. The Highline Park, this is the Highline in New York City, is a greenway. Okay, so it's a strip of land that connects parks or neighborhoods. So it's a walking trail, and it's green, and it's beautiful, and it's this outdoor space in the city. They took an elevated rail line and turned it into a park, which I think is pretty cool. A green belt versus a green way. A green way is within a city and it connects green areas. A green belt is around the city. And there's a really big green belt around Toronto, Canada. All right, so you can see the green space around the city. It's actually very beautiful. I've been there. One way that we can make our urban development greener is to develop greener buildings, right? Green buildings where you minimize the ecological footprint of a building during construction and during operation. So you build things from sustainable materials. You are concerned about energy use and water use. You control pollution. You recycle waste. The buildings are pretty efficient. we're getting closer to that here, but we're definitely not there. So these are some examples of how you can greenify your house, okay? Greenify a building, rain gardens, energy efficient lights and fixtures, water efficient appliances, all that kind of thing. And there's a U.S. Green Building Council that provides award certifications to buildings that are green. It's called the LEED program, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. If your building does these things, okay, you can be eligible for LEED certification. The building at the Grounds for Sculpture in Mercer County in Hamilton is a silver LEED certified building. So it was pretty cool, when I go there, it's like, hey, I know what that is. So they've hit 50 points for that, which I think is pretty cool. So everything sounds like cities are the place to be, and we need to move into urban areas to reduce our ecological footprint. But cities are not the solution to all of the world's problems, okay? There are positive and negative environmental impacts of these cities. So, for example, cities are resource sinks, okay? So they don't have the resources necessary to feed and clothe and provide water to their inhabitants, okay? So all that stuff needs to be imported in. So let's take water in New York City for an example. There are aqueducts, okay, that take water from upstate New York and Connecticut and bring it into New York City, okay? So it requires watersheds to they import water from other places to bring it into New York City. New York City doesn't have its own water. Not having water is problematic. So you're definitely reliant on outside sources for water and food. Getting stuff to urban centers is going to require energy, right? So to get everything, to get electricity to an urban center or to get water to an urban center is going to take a lot of material and a lot of infrastructure and a lot of lines and pipes. But once it's there, it's distributed to, or even like cable TV, it's distributed to the population much more efficiently, right? So instead of having a well for each house out here, you have one main water line that runs into a building, and it can handle 200 people in an apartment building, okay? Cities tend to have a greater ecological footprint than their actual geographic area, but that's because of the affluence and the consumerism that tends to take place in cities versus rural areas. If people pack together in an urban area, we reduce habitat fragmentation outside. So the idea of an urban growth boundary is good, okay? But so by keeping people concentrated in cities, you preserve that biodiversity outside of those cities. So we have to import people living in cities have to import their materials. They have to export the pollution, okay? They either export waste actively or passively. So pollution from power plants like the Finger Lakes, right? In the Industrial Revolution times, you had people who were, factories that popped up around the Great Lakes, and they would spew their pollution up into the atmosphere. And that pollution would go up into the atmosphere, and it would blow over towards the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, because that's the way the wind blew. So there are a lot of dead lakes up there in the Finger Lakes area because of acid precipitation that happened, that was originated from the Great Lakes. Okay, so that area, that precipitation and that pollution gets spread further away. if you're living in an urban area, based on the industrialization that's there, you're exposed disproportionately, as opposed to someone who lives in a rural area, to pretty bad things: heavy metals, industrial compounds, airborne pollutants, and the idea of thermal pollution by heat. Okay. Cities also tend to have ambient temperatures, or average temperatures, that are higher than the surrounding area, because all of that concrete tends to, and dark materials tends to re-radiate the heat. And that's called an urban heat island. Okay. So if you look at the weather out here in the summer versus in the city in the summer, it's going to be warmer in the cities, because all of that material, right, the buildings, the cars, the pavement, it absorbs that sunlight during the day and then re-radiates it at night. It comes back out. Okay. When you're out in the outer areas, right, the farmlands and the forests, okay, that the idea of transpiration happens. So the heat from the land, it's part of the water cycle, the heat from the land comes out in what I referred to as plant sweat. Okay. The buildings also block wind currents, and water runs off instead of evaporating. The reason why we sweat is because the moisture gets on our skin and it evaporates, and it takes the heat with it. Okay. You don't get that evaporation in the city because the water doesn't stay, it runs off. There are other kinds of noise pollution, right? Other kinds of pollution. One is noise pollution, and we're going to do a lab to monitor your risk for exposure to noise pollution. It can cause stress, and it can cause hearing loss if you are exposed to it too much. Light pollution is when you see clouds of colored light when in the dark, because street lights and that kind of thing. And it can also cause issues with sleep. This is the idea of runoff. We talked about it a little bit earlier in this lecture. Precipitation that falls onto the surface doesn't percolate down in to the groundwater to replenish aquifers. It runs over those impervious surfaces, pavements and driveways, and washes pollutants with it that winds up causing water pollution. Well, there you go. There it is again. It causes cultural eutrophication, can do that as well. Urban centers historically have been a place where creativity and ingenuity and all that kind of stuff really comes together. There's some really good ideas when you put people together that are working towards the same goal. And when you spread everybody out, you don't really get that. How can we be more sustainable in our urban centers? Really think long term. Humans tend not to think long term when it comes to planning cities and that kind of thing. Use smart growth and new urbanism to reduce consumption and come up with alternatives for transportation, provide that green space. And when you build buildings, make sure that you're using green methods. Okay? So there are some pros and cons to urbanization.